Thank you so much for joining us for another edition of All Angles. I'm Dion Jackson Miller. So, more outrage and controversy over sentencing. Are the sentences being handed down by our judges too light? Are they too lenient? That's something we've been arguing about for years, most recently in the sentence just handed down in the Davian Bryan case. We're going to be talking about that and sentencing generally. In studio with me, I have Senior Deputy Director of Public Prosecutions, King's Counsel, Jeremy Taylor, and joining me online will be, on Zoom I should say, will be Senior Counsel Clyde Williams as well as Michael Jackson from Jamaicans for Justice. Before that though, let's look at this overview. 34-year-old Davian Bryan was sentenced in the St. Thomas Parish Court on May 31.
He was sentenced to 23 years and 3 months and will be eligible for parole after serving 16 years.
When I read the news, I cried because I said, young lad go to jail, go to taxpayer money, and when you look at your year, say you might not get parole by that time. I don't feel good.
Like if the system has set more example for that, so people can say, yeah, them can't do this thing because they can't go to prison and come back.
It wasn't the first time the public has been outraged following a sentence. A 2021 La Pop survey reported Jamaicans overwhelmingly want more severe punishment of criminals. 67%, that's 2 out of every 3 Jamaicans, strongly agree that punishment for crime should increase. The government has given prosecutors a right to appeal against sentences they think too lenient. When Lindell Powell received a 12-year sentence for murder, the DPP successfully appealed and the Court of Appeal substituted life sentences instead.
As far as we are concerned, the sentence was unduly lenient and it was inadequate.
He'll now have to serve nearly 25 years before being eligible for parole. Now, earlier today I spoke with Justice Minister Delroy Chuck, who has been critical of the latest sentence in the Davian Bryan case and also has made comments about sentencing in the past. And Minister of Justice Delroy Chuck joins me now in studio. Minister, thanks so much for talking to us. Now, you've been talking about sentencing for a while now. Let me just quote a couple of your comments. In 2018, you had said the time for light sentences is over. In 2021, in your sectoral presentation, you called for tougher sentences. You said when sentences are lenient or out of the established sentencing range, the public is also alarmed at the inadequacy of the sentence. And in 2022, you called for judges to impose life sentences on those found guilty of serious crimes. And of course, this latest incident with Bryan, where you expressed your disappointment and said you thought a life sentence may have been more appropriate. Is it that you don't trust our judges to impose sufficient and appropriate sentences?
Not at all. I think in 90% of the cases, the judges do impose appropriate sentences. But I'm very concerned that in really exceptional cases, especially where the conduct of the criminal is so egregious that the sentence should reflect the sentiments of the society. And in the recent case, of Bryan, this fellow is clearly a serial rapist and has demonstrated that he is really a danger to young girls in our society by his actions. And in a situation in which you have 3 cases involving a 9, 13, and 16-year-old girls, that at the end of the day, the sentence is only 23 years that has been imposed because they're all concurrent. And he must serve at least 16 years before being eligible for parole. But when you look at the 12 counts, they add up to 153 years. Now, if you had taken each case separately and he had to start his sentence after he has completed for each case, he may well serve 90 years. So at the end of the day, the question is why I'm not critical of the judge, because in each count, he may well have imposed a sentence within the sentencing guidelines, and in fact may well be at the upper end of the sentencing guidelines. But when you combine all the counts, my criticism is, could he have found a way to say on this or these 2 cases of rape, life sentences could have been imposed?
You say you're not critical of the judge, but that's precisely what you are.
Well, I'm not critical and say he was wrong in what he has done. I'm just critical to say he could have done more and impose a sentence that reflect the feelings and sentiments in the society.
But you are saying he's wrong then, or her. I don't even know.
Well, put it another way. What he has done cannot be criticized in terms of each count, because they're within the sentencing guidelines. But when you look at the accumulative effect of all 12 counts on 3 girls, then an appropriate sentence at the end of the day, the cumulative effect of it should have been a life sentence.
You say that the sentence should reflect the sentiments of society. And whereas we know that the courts have said that you don't want to impose a sentence that outrages society, on the other hand, though, sometimes the public doesn't understand the factors that are taken into account in sentencing, and how the judge has to balance the aggravating factors, which could make the sentence worse, mitigating factors which could lighten the sentence. So doesn't the judge also have a duty to hold fast against outrage and understandable emotionalism that may not necessarily be grounded on a full understanding of what goes into sentencing?
Absolutely. And that is why a judge has to balance all the factors.
But one doesn't get that sense listening to you, though.
No, and that is why I'm saying we should have in all sentencing cases an impact statement, certainly a social inquiry report. It should be that the victim, if the victim is alive or capable, or the victim families and friends, should be interviewed or should at least be allowed in appropriate cases to make their comments either via the prosecution or in open court. You see this in the United States of America. They actually have sentencing hearings. Now, I'm not necessarily calling for sentencing hearings, but at the very minimum, you should have impact statements where the views of the victims and their families can be taken into account. It should not be, especially after a guilty plea, where all the facts have not come out which would happen at a trial. So after trial, the judge would be aware of all the factors and therefore is in a position to take all the various factors into consideration, and maybe only want to hear about the social inquiry, about the personality of the offender. During a guilty plea, apart from the outline of the facts by the prosecution, all the details do not come out. The judge would not have heard the victims or the witnesses. And in such cases, my view is you need to have a broader overview of the aggravating factors, which could come from an impact statement.
The president of the Advocates Association, Leonard Green, is quoted in the Gleaner expressing concern about your comments in the Davion Bryan case. He said it can be seen as inappropriate in circumstances where the judge would have exercised their discretion and imposed a sentence they deemed appropriate.
Right. But let's face it, Dion. I mean, I'm disappointed that Leon could see it that way. Decisions are not sacrosanct, In fact, we have Court of Appeal 2-3 tiers because they get it wrong many times. So to the extent that we have even given the Director of Public Prosecution the right to appeal is an indication that the judges don't always get it right. Now, the question is...
Mr. Green, there is also concern that your comments could be seen as undermining the judiciary. When you have a minister repeatedly expressing concern about sentences that have been imposed by the judiciary, could it look as if you're trying to pressure them into imposing harsher sentences?
And at the same time, they know that I support them in 90% of the cases, but in that less than 10% of the cases where I feel that they could have imposed a more emphatic sentence, then I have no problem in expressing publicly the feelings of the ordinary man. And as you know, judges are not open to criticism. And the fact that you criticize a decision of a judge doesn't mean that you're undermining the judge or the judiciary.
You mentioned the issue of the right of appeal that's been given to the prosecution. We saw the DPP very quickly, in fact, make an appeal, and that appeal was successful. Is it something you want to see the prosecutor's office?
In appropriate cases. And I really hope that there won't be too many cases. And the reason why I hope that there won't be too many cases, if, especially in a guilty plea, the views of the prosecution are taken into account, then it solves the problem. It's a different, and sometimes if the views are taken into account and dismissed, that's when the prosecution may well appeal. But at the end of the day, one would hope that sentencing is just not primarily, yes, the prerogative of the sentencing judge, but at least the judge should take into consideration the aggravating factors that the prosecution might put forward,
but they do,
and the mitigating factors.
But they do. When have you? There's never been a sentencing. Well, certainly none have participated in or observed, where the judge does not meticulously go through the list of aggravating factors and the list of mitigating factors. That's a part of the process.
I accept that, but that doesn't mean he gets it right.
Sure, but that's different from saying you wish they would.
I don't think they do all the time. So you have a situation where, look at the case of Brian. The fellow pleaded guilty. I don't know if in a social inquiry report, if certainly the witnesses or the families of the victims were not interviewed. The mother of one of the victims came and said she only heard she was expecting to go back to court. And that, by the way, has happened in many cases where victims of families have called me and say, call me in and express the view that justice was not done because they can't understand why the sentence was imposed. And I have to explain to them that it is all the prerogative of the judge. The justice minister cannot dictate to the judge what sentence to be imposed.
Let's just clarify, though, because you mentioned there the families and then you mentioned social inquiry reports. Social inquiry reports are routinely done in these kinds of matters. Those are when the probation officer goes into the community, speaks to community members, tries to get, and speaks to the person who has been convicted or pled guilty as well to get an assessment of what their background has been. That's routine. And the courts have said,
I don't get the impression that
in serious matters, certainly social inquiry reports must be done. So, I mean, I can call to find out if it's been done in this case, but I'm going to bet that it has been because it's routine.
I have my doubts, and the reason why I have my doubts...
But you can pick up the phone and ask the Justice Minister.
The families and the people in the community are very annoyed and upset with the sentence. So would they have been consulted? And by the way, the fact that...
Mr. Joe...
one second. The fact that they were consulted doesn't mean that the sentence of the court is necessarily correct.
No, but that's why I'm saying, with respect, I'm trying to ensure that we're not mixing up different things. And the fact of the conduct of a social inquiry report, I am just saying that's routine.
Okay.
That's routine. Whether or not people like the outcome now is a completely different situation.